Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in Montgomery's history. Before we start, please leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and what time it is when you are listening to this. We want to know where these documented stories go and when they get there, whether it's during the day or at night. The year was 1851 when the person went missing. Montgomery, Alabama, was a city of stark contrasts. Big columned houses stood above streets where people were bought and sold every day. At this time, something happened at the Turner Plantation, which is 17 miles east of the city proper. This event would stay hidden in county records and be talked about in whispers for decades. The Turner estate was famous for its cotton fields that made a lot of money and for the family's status in Montgomery society. Josiah Turner, who was 44 years old, got the plantation from his father in 1838. People knew him as a very good businessman because he grew the estate's holdings to more than 600 acres. His wife, Elelena Pierce Turner, was 39 years old and came from a wealthy family in Charleston. The couple was well liked in the community. They went to St. John's Episcopal Church every Sunday and hosted summer parties that people from as far away as Mobile came to. The Turners were different from many of their peers because their house was unusually quiet. Not because they were rich, they were, but not in a way that was out of the ordinary. People who came to the estate often talked about how strange the silence was. The Montgomery County Historical Society says that the plantation had 28 slaves working there, but guests would often say that they didn't see or hear much going on outside of the main house. The 1,850 census showed that the Turner household only included the couple. They had been married for 13 years and had no children during that time. People who knew Elelena Turner said she didn't talk about her personal life very much, but they knew she did charitable work through the church. Martha Whitfield, a neighbor, wrote in a letter in 1862 that Miss Turner carries herself with such stillness as though she moves through the world bearing a weight invisible to others. County records show that on the 7th of April, 1851, Josiah Turner told authorities that an enslaved person named Samuel, who was about 24 years old, had gone missing. What made this report different from others like it at the time was that Turner strongly wanted to involve the county sheriff, Richard Holcomb. Plantation owners usually took care of things like this on their own, especially when they were about things that were legally considered property. Sheriff Holcomb's log, which is kept in the Alabama Department of Archives and History, says that at first he didn't want to spend money on the issue. Mr. Turner is acting in an unusual way because his property is missing, the sheriff wrote. While such concern might be warranted for a valuable asset, his manner suggests something beyond mere financial consideration. There are official records and the sheriff's personal journal that show he went to the Turner plantation. The journal was found during a renovation of the old county courthouse in 1963. He writes that the Turner home was very well kept, but there was a sense of unease in the air that even the spring breeze coming through the open windows couldn't get rid of. What happened next would start to break down a carefully kept silence that had lasted for years. On April 10th, 3 days after the first report, a storm caused a lot of damage across the county. A big oak tree fell on the Turner property, revealing a patch of disturbed earth that had been hidden under its roots. Sheriff's records say that a field hand found what looked like human remains while clearing the tree that had fallen. They called Sheriff Holcomb back to the plantation right away. His official report says that the remains were in a state that suggested they had been buried for no more than 4 to 6 months. This timeline made things immediately unclear, because there had been no reports of deaths or disappearances on the Turner plantation during that time. The discovery led to a more in-depth look at the property. A search of a well-known person's estate came next, which was strange for the time. The planter class would have strongly opposed this kind of action because they had a lot of control over their land and what happened on it. But court records show that Josiah Turner didn't object to the search. He only said, "The truth must be known, whatever it may reveal." There was a very different record of Elelena Turner's reaction. Thomas Mercer, the sheriff's deputy, said that Mrs. Turner stayed seated in the parlor with her hands folded in her lap and didn't say anything or show any signs of distress as the men walked through her house. Several witnesses would later comment on this strange calm. The search of the grounds didn't turn up anything that needed immediate attention until people started looking at a small building that was separate from the slave quarters. Records from 1849 show that the building was used to store tools and seeds, but when officers went inside, they saw that the building had been changed. They dug out the floor to make a space that was about 6 feet deep. A rough ladder made it possible to get to this pit. Sheriff Holcomb's own journal has the most information about what was found. There is evidence of long-term human habitation in this space, such as a pallet of straw, a container for waste, and scratches on the wall that look like they mark the passage of time. The small size of the space and the way it was built suggests that it was used as a place of confinement rather than shelter. Josiah Turner is said to have said that he didn't know anything about the structure's changes when asked about it. This suggests that the changes must have been made without his knowledge. People were doubtful of this explanation because plantation owners usually keep a close eye on any changes to their land. It was even more worrying to find a small journal hidden in the wall of the pit. The journal, which was later proven to belong to Elelana Turner by comparing her handwriting to that of her letters, had entries that went back 3 years. Officials who looked at the contents said they were disturbing because they told of suffering in a detached way. Public records left out some details, but later court documents mentioned the journal's observations of people being locked up and what was called experimental modification of behavior. On the 15th of April, 1851, police arrested both Josiah and Elelana Turner. The charges were strange for the time because they didn't have much legal weight when it came to how enslaved people were treated. Instead, they were about the suspected murder of 2 white overseers who worked on the plantation and were thought to have left for better opportunities further west in 1849 and 1850. The bones found under the oak tree were eventually identified as those of Jonathan Reed, who was 37 years old and had been the overseer on the Turner plantation from 1846 until he supposedly left in October 1849. Dental records and personal items found with the body confirmed the person's identity. A serious skull fracture was found to be the cause of death. The investigation that followed led to a search for the second overseer, William Sloan, who was 41 years old. Plantation records show that Sloan was hired soon after Reed left and left himself in July 1850. We couldn't find any proof that Sloan worked anywhere else. Even after we asked people in Mississippi and Louisiana, Samuel, the enslaved man whose disappearance had set off the whole chain of events, came back during this part of the investigation. He was discovered walking along a road almost 30 miles from the Turner plantation. He was confused and looked like he hadn't eaten in a while. His testimony before the sheriff shed light on what really happened at the Turner estate. Because of the laws at the time, Samuel's testimony could not be used in court against white people. Sheriff Holcomb did write down his story, though, in his private papers. These papers say that Samuel told Mrs. Turner that she had chosen him for special service in the main house. This job, which was sought after because it didn't involve working in the field, quickly turned out to be something much worse. Samuel said that he was kept in the modified outbuilding for up to 3 days at a time, during which time he was subjected to different types of psychological manipulation. He said that Mrs. Turner talked to him through a small hole in the ceiling of the pit. Sometimes she would read passages from scientific texts, and other times she would just watch how he reacted to being alone, for a long time, in the dark, or in the rain. Samuel's story about seeing Overseer Reed die was the most upsetting. Reed's testimony says that he found out what Mrs. Turner was up to and told her husband about it. The fight got worse, and Reed was hit with a tool from the fireplace. Samuel said that he had to help get rid of the body by digging the grave under the oak tree at night. William Sloan is said to have met a similar fate, but Samuel only knew about it indirectly because he was in prison at the time. He said he heard the Turners talking about how to deal with the Sloan situation after the overseer started asking questions about Reed's sudden departure and the strange noises that sometimes came from the outbuilding. Josiah Turner had let Samuel escape because he wasn't paying attention and didn't lock the pit's hatch properly. Samuel had been on the run for days after leaving the plantation, too scared to talk to anyone because he was afraid of being sent back to the Turners. The case against the Turners moved slowly because of their social status and the fact that authorities were hesitant to believe an enslaved person, even when it came to crimes against white victims. But the physical evidence, especially Elelana's journal and Jonathan Reed's body, was enough to keep the investigation going. As word of the case spread through Montgomery society, more stories started to come out. People who had stayed at the Turner home before remembered strange rules about which parts of the property they could visit. A former servant who now works in another house said that late at night, they heard cries coming from the direction of the outbuilding that quickly stopped. Dr. Robert Wilson's testimony was probably the most damaging. He had treated Ella Turner for what Josiah called nervous episodes. Dr. Wilson's medical notes, which were submitted to the court, showed that Mrs. Turner had talked at length about her interest in the thresholds of human endurance and the science of breaking and remaking the human spirit. The doctor said that these disturbing things, she said, were caused by the laudanum he had given her for her condition. On the 3rd of September, 1851, Josiah and Ella Turner's trial began. It went on for 11 days, which was a long time for the time. Ella Turner stayed calm the whole time. She was said to have taken detailed notes while witnesses were on the stand, and to have whispered instructions to her lawyer often. On the other hand, Josiah seemed to get more and more upset as the evidence piled up. On the 9th day of the trial, things took a shocking turn when Josiah Turner changed his plea to guilty and confessed everything, saying that his wife was the one behind the terrible things that happened on their property. He said in court that he only did it because he was afraid of Eleanor, who he said had a coldness of mind that masks an unnatural fascination with suffering. Ella Turner's response to this betrayal was simply a long, judging look at her husband before she went back to her notes without saying anything. When she was given the chance to speak up for herself, she refused, saying only that future minds will better understand the necessity of my inquiries. Josiah Turner was sentenced to death on the 14th of September, 1851, for killing Jonathan Reed and William Sloan. The body of William Sloan had not yet been found, but circumstantial evidence showed that he was dead. Ella Turner was also given the death penalty, which was an unusual punishment for a woman of her social class at the time. The deaths were supposed to happen on the 12th of November, 1851, but records from the past show that only Josiah Turner was hanged that day. On the morning of November 3rd, Ella Turner was found dead in her cell. The official cause of death was failure of the heart, but there were rumors that she had somehow gotten poison. In the winter of 1851, a final disturbing epilogue to the case came to light. Workers tearing down the outbuilding on the old Turner property found a sealed area under the floorboards that was different from the pit that had already been found. There were human remains in this space, which were later identified as William Sloan's. There was a leather-bound book next to the remains that seemed to be Ella Turner's notes. They were written in a careful hand and talked about the progressive phases of isolation's effect on the rational mind. The Turner case quickly faded from public record, maybe because people didn't want to think about what it meant. The plantation was sold, its name was changed, and people were told to forget about its past. The case didn't get back into the news until 1963, when a graduate student at Auburn University named Margaret Coleman found Sheriff Holcomb's personal papers while looking into how the police worked before the Civil War. Coleman's thesis, The Silent House: Power, Cruelty, and Scientific Curiosity in the Antebellum South, was the first full study of the Turner case. Her research indicated that Ella Turner's actions exemplified an early, unacknowledged instance of systematic psychological torture masquerading as scientific investigation. Coleman observed unsettling similarities between the methods delineated in Ella writings and techniques subsequently recorded in more formal contexts during the 20th century. The Turner plantation house is no longer there because it burned down in 1878. There is no physical sign of what happened there now that the land has been divided and built on. Local historians have sometimes suggested building a memorial to remember the pain that happened on the site, especially the pain of the enslaved people who were treated cruelly by the Turners. However, these ideas have never gotten enough support. After the trial, there is no more information about Samuel, who was brave enough to escape and testify, which was a key part of bringing the Turners to justice. There is no record of what happened to him, but oral histories from black communities in Montgomery County from the 1962 tell of a man who came back from a living burial and then helped others escape to the north. It is said that the journal with Ella Turner's notes was kept in the Montgomery County Courthouse until 1954, when it disappeared during a reorganization of the archives. No one knows where it is now, but there are rumors that private collectors have what they say are the original manuscript or copies of its contents. The Turner case is still very disturbing, not just because of what happened, but also because of the conditions that let it go on for so long without anyone noticing. The power structures of the antebellum South, especially the legal and social framework of slavery, made it possible for such terrible things to happen while still appearing respectable. People assumed that the Turners were good people because of their social status, which kept people from looking into them until the evidence became too strong to ignore. Dr. James Harrison, a psychology professor at Tuskegee University, wrote an analysis of the Turner case in 1969 using the historical documents that were available at the time. He said that Elena Turner's actions showed a disturbing mix of pseudoscientific curiosity and the moral decay that comes from a system that treats people like property. Harrison said that similar patterns of behavior have shown up in other closed systems where people have total power over others and don't have to answer for it. Catherine Mercer, the granddaughter of Deputy Thomas Mercer, was the last person known to have had a direct connection to the case. She had helped search the Turner property. Catherine, who was 93 years old at the time of the interview in 1967, remembered that her grandfather didn't want to talk about the case. He would only say that there are some things that people shouldn't be able to do to each other, and that he had seen such things at the Turner place, she said. Whatever he saw there bothered him for the rest of his life. The Turner case is mostly just a footnote in academic studies of crime in the antebellum South today. The case is not well known because there are not complete records. People at the time tried to hide details that made them uncomfortable, and the enslaved victims could not write down their experiences in their own words. The echoes of what happened on that plantation still ring out, reminding us of how cruel people can be when they have too much power and don't care about the suffering of the weak. A promise to recognize and fight against such abuses wherever they happen may be the best way to remember the people who died on the Turner plantation. The Turner case serves as a cautionary tale for those who examine the more sinister aspects of American history, highlighting the repercussions of unrestrained power and the perils of unregulated scientific inquiry. It reminds us that real horror isn't caused by supernatural forces. It's caused by the choices that normal people make when they see others as less than human. After the trial was over, it was said that the old oak tree that used to be on the Turner property was cut up and the wood burned. This tree's fall was the first sign of what was below the surface. No one wanted things from that place in their homes. Some boundaries leave permanent marks on the landscapes they used to be in, even if those marks are no longer visible. The quiet that visitors used to notice at the Turner plantation has, in a way, lasted through time. The voices of those who suffered there have mostly been lost, and their experiences have only been recorded by the people who hurt them. That silence may hold the greatest horror of all, not just what happened, but how easy it was to hide it, and how many of its details have been lost. But there is still something. There is a single page torn from what looks like a personal diary in the Montgomery County Historical Society's archives, along with tax records and property deeds from the 1,850 seconds. The writing looks like Elena Turner's letters. It has only one sentence. They think the greatest pain lies in physical suffering, but I have found it lives in the mind, in the spaces between what was and what might be. Some doors can never really be closed again once they are opened. The Turner case may have ended with the deaths of Josiah and Eleanor, but new information kept coming to light in the years that followed. In 1863, when the Civil War was at its worst, Union soldiers in Montgomery found a locked chest in the attic of a house that used to belong to Elena Turner's lawyer, Hamilton Brooks. A Union captain who was interested in legal matters made a list of the items, which included letters between Eleanor and Brooks from 1847. These letters, which are now kept in pieces at the Library of Congress, show a disturbing change in Elena's way of thinking. In her first letters, she talks about the psychology of servitude in a clinical way. Her language had changed a lot by 1849. She talks about breakthrough moments when subjects, she never uses the word people, transcend their understanding of themselves as autonomous beings. Brooks never told the authorities about these troubling conversations, though, because attorney-client privilege protected them. but his own notes on the letters show that he is becoming more and more uncomfortable. He wrote in one letter, dated January 1850, Mrs. T's academic interests take a troubling turn. Advised greater discretion in both action and correspondence. When Union officials found these letters, they briefly became interested in the case again. But with the war still going on and more pressing issues to deal with, they did not start a formal reinvestigation. The issue was noted and put away, becoming another piece of the broken historical record. In 1872, Dr. Elias Thornton wrote an article for a medical journal about what he called the boundaries of scientific inquiry. He didn't name the Turner case, but he did mention a recent instance in the South wherein a woman of education perverted scientific curiosity toward inhumane ends. Thornton said that these kinds of cases showed how important it was for the scientific community to have ethical oversight, which was a very progressive view for the time. In 1958, historian Rebecca Mills found proof that Dr. Thornton was Elelena Pierce Turner's cousin and that they had grown up together in Charleston. Family letters suggest that he went to the Turner plantation in 1848 and left after only 2 days, cutting short his plans to stay longer. He never said anything about this link to the case in public. One of the most disturbing things about the Turner case is how it set the stage for later, more widespread abuses of scientific authority. Elelena Turner's private experiments, carried out without supervision or ethical limitations, exhibit unsettling parallels to studies that would receive formal approval in the subsequent century. Her detailed notes on psychological breaking points, the effects of isolation, and methods for getting people to comply seem almost like predictions of methods that would later be improved in institutional settings. Archaeologist Martin Whitaker found what looked like a root cellar on the old Turner property in 1965, before it was developed for business. This was not mentioned in the original investigation. He found pieces of glass containers in the space, which had been partially filled with dirt over the years. Some of the containers still had labels from apothecaries in Charleston and Richmond. Researchers found chemicals in the residue from these containers that were used in different sedatives and hallucinogens that doctors knew about in the 1850 seconds. This finding gave us a new way to think about how Elelena Turner worked. The earlier journal entries had talked about administering preparations to heighten suggestibility, but they hadn't gone into detail about what those preparations were. The physical evidence indicated that her method involved both psychological manipulation and chemical inducements, which was a very advanced way of doing things at the time. The combination of being alone, mental stress, and drugs makes it easier to break down established ways of thinking and acting. Contemporary experts examining the documentation from the Turner case have observed parallels to methods subsequently recorded in diverse contexts aimed at achieving coercive control. What really sets the Turner case apart is how Elelena seemed to take a scientific approach. Elelena Turner's careful record-keeping shows that she saw herself as doing real research, unlike others who might have been cruel just for the sake of being cruel or to keep people in line. She didn't have any formal scientific training, which was mostly not available to women of her time, but she did have a lot of private schooling. The Turner household's inventory records showed that their library had a lot of medical and scientific books, which is not common for a plantation library. In a 1967 paper about the Turner case, Professor Amelia Richardson of Howard University said that Elelena was a dark mirror of the scientific exclusion of her time. Because she was a woman, she wasn't allowed to formally join the scientific community, so she built her own lab where she was in charge. Richardson wrote, "The tragedy goes beyond her victims, to include what such an intellect might have done if it had been properly channeled and guided by ethics." The 1,860 census showed that 21 people were still slaves on the Turner plantation after the arrests. Most of them were sold to pay off estate debts after the executions. There is no evidence in county records that any special treatment was given to people who had been part of Elelena Turner's experiments. They just disappeared into the larger group of enslaved people, and the legal system that treated them like property didn't acknowledge their specific traumatic experiences. Oral histories gathered from descendants of enslaved communities in Montgomery County encompass narratives that may pertain to the Turner case, although names and specific details have been modified over generations of retelling. There are stories of a witch woman who collected souls in bottles, and a pit where people went in whole and came out hollow. These stories, while not historically verifiable in their details, show how the trauma has affected community memory over time. In the years after the trial, people in the area started to believe in superstitions about the Turner plantation house. Historical records show that it stood until it was destroyed by fire in 1878. However, many accounts from the time between then and now say that it was abandoned or avoided, even though it was occupied by later owners. James Merrill, the property's owner at the time, wrote a letter in 1865 saying that it was hard to keep household staff because of persistent and irrational fears associated with the property's history. A lightning strike during a severe summer storm caused the fire that eventually destroyed the house. Modern newspaper articles say that even though the house was close to town, no real effort was made to save it once it was clear that no lives were at risk. One reporter said that people watched with what might be described as grim satisfaction as the flames consumed what many have long considered a place of dark history. William Hayes, a cotton merchant, bought the land in 1883. He then divided it into smaller pieces and sold them to tenant farmers. This effectively erased the physical boundaries that had once defined the Turner plantation. This breaking up of the property happened at the same time as bigger changes in how land was used after the Civil War and Reconstruction. As the plantation system changed to new ways of owning and working, the land was physically spread out, just like the information about what had happened there. There was no central place to keep records about the case, and many of the main people involved were dead or had moved away. As a result, knowledge of the Turner atrocities became less and less complete. By the end of the century, most people had forgotten about it. It lived on mostly in academic archives and local oral history. This pattern of forgetting and remembering has been a part of the Turner case from the beginning. Every so often, a new piece of evidence comes to light, like a letter in a private collection, a journal entry in an unrelated archive, or a story told by a descendant. This brings the case back into focus for a short time before it disappears again. In 1947, workers digging for a business building on what had once been the eastern edge of the Turner property found a bunch of small glass bottles buried about 4 feet below the surface. There was a folded piece of paper in each one, and each paper had a name written on it in what handwriting experts later said was Ella Lenina Turner's unique style. The names didn't match any people listed in census or property records for the Turner household. When the Montgomery Advertiser reported on this discovery, an elderly woman named Sarah Johnson came forward with information that her grandmother, who had been enslaved on a nearby plantation, had passed down to her. This family story says that Ella Lenina Turner would take the names of people who were in her experiments and tell them they wouldn't need them where they were going. The buried bottles, which Ella Lenina is said to have called the discarded selves, may be a part of her activities that weren't recorded in the official record. This account, though impossible to verify definitively, corresponds with journal fragments in which Eleanor discussed individuals arriving at what she referred to as the point of identity surrender. The physical evidence of the buried bottles indicates that her methodology incorporated both symbolic and practical components, possibly intended to enhance the psychological effects of her techniques. By the middle of the 20th century, the story of the Turner plantation had become an academic curiosity. It was sometimes mentioned in specialized studies, but most people didn't know about it. Historian Charles Morgan's book, The Science of Cruelty, The Turner Case and the Roots of Modern Psychological Manipulation, came out in 1969 and changed things a little. Morgan's work put the case in a wider historical context, saying that it wasn't an isolated incident, but an early example of trends that would later become more institutionalized. Morgan's research got better when he found a bunch of letters that Sheriff Richard Holcomb wrote to his brother in Virginia. These letters, which are more detailed and honest than his official reports, show how horrified Holcomb became as the investigation went on. "I have seen battlefields and hangings," he wrote in May 1851, "but never have I encountered such calculated coldness." His letters mentioned many displayed unusual behavioral patterns, including an extreme reluctance to speak in the presence of white authorities beyond what would be typical for the time, physical flinching at certain words or phrases, and what he described as an absence behind the eyes, as though the person to whom one speaks is somewhere else entirely. These observations, made by a man with no formal training in psychology but considerable experience observing human behavior in his law enforcement role, suggest the far-reaching impact of Ella Turner's experiments on those who survived them. Turner talked about what she did with the same distance that someone might use to talk about rotating crops or breeding horses. Holcomb's story of talking to other enslaved people from the Turner plantation is especially interesting. The effects he talked about are very similar to what modern doctors would call signs of severe psychological trauma. In 1964, when the civil rights movement was at its peak, a group of students and faculty from Alabama State College, now Alabama State University, tried to put together a memorial service for the people who died at the Turner plantation. Local officials opposed their efforts, saying they were worried about making historical grievances worse during an already tense time. The service was finally held on campus instead of at the old plantation site. During the service, people read aloud the names of all the people they knew who had been enslaved by the Turners, even those whose fates were not known. This act of remembrance was one of the first times that the focus was on the experiences of the main victims instead of the sensational parts of the case or Ella Turner's mental state. It signified a transformation in the discourse surrounding the Turner case in later academic literature, with a growing focus on the resilience and agency of individuals who suffered and occasionally opposed the Turners' brutality. In 1972, linguist Dr. Patricia Coleman released a study of the parts of Ella Turner's writings that had been kept. She noted what she termed a progressive dehumanization in language choice over time, with initial entries referencing subjects and subsequent ones employing terms such as specimens and materials. This linguistic transition paralleled the intensification of Eleanor's experimental methodologies, indicating a self-reinforcing cycle wherein alterations in language both mirrored and facilitated heightened moral disengagement. The most comprehensive understanding of events at the Turner plantation may not derive from a singular source, but rather from the amalgamation of various fragments: official records, private correspondence, oral histories, physical evidence, and scholarly analysis. The individual pieces come together to make a coherent and disturbing picture of systematic cruelty that is justified by pseudoscientific reasoning and made possible by the larger social context of slavery. The case brings up uncomfortable questions about the connection between scientific research and moral limits. These questions are still important even after the events at the Turner plantation have become history. Eleanor Turner's actions took place in a system that already didn't treat the people she experimented on as full humans. It was easier than you might think to go from legally sanctioned dehumanization to the extremes she went to. A dissertation by doctoral student Marcus Jenkins at the University of Alabama in 2003 looked at county records and property transactions to find out what happened to the 21 people who stayed enslaved on the Turner plantation. After the arrests, his research showed that 14 were sold to a plantation in Mississippi, 4 to different buyers in Alabama, and 3 to a cotton farm in Georgia. After emancipation, census records from 1,870 and 1,880 showed that 7 people had the same names and ages as those on the Turner property. This suggests that they lived long enough to enjoy their freedom. Maria, a woman who was 23 years old in the 1850 census and 43 years old in the 1870 census, was one of the survivors. She wrote a rare first-person account of life after the Turner plantation. In a story written down by a Freedmen's Bureau agent in 1868, she talked about how her experience still affects her. "There are nights still when I wake, believing I am back in that place where the mistress would speak through the ceiling like the voice of God, telling me I was nothing, no one, until I almost believed it. Freedom means I can say my name out loud and know it belongs to me alone." This testimony is probably the most direct way to learn about what happened to people who were part of Eleanor Turner's psychological 12 pleas experiments. It illustrates the deep trauma caused and the incredible strength of the human spirit when people try to break it down. The last known mention of the Turner case in the 19th century is in an 1897 medical journal. A doctor talks about mental disorders and uses the notorious Alabama case as an example of how long-term isolation and psychological pressure can have effects like physical trauma, even though there are no visible signs. This acknowledgement of the existence of psychological injury, a concept still developing in contemporary medical literature, indicates the case's enduring influence on the comprehension of mental health. As the 20th century advanced, the Turner case periodically re-emerged in scholarly literature analyzing the history of psychology, the ramifications of slavery, or the development of ethical standards in scientific research. Every new generation of scholars brought new ways of looking at and analyzing the limited evidence that was still around. In 1977, archaeologist Deborah Williams did a systematic survey of what historical records said was the location of the outbuilding where Ella Turner did most of her experiments. Ground-penetrating radar found what looked like a rectangular subsurface anomaly that matched the size of the pit described in sheriff's records, even though the structure itself was long gone and the area had been used for different things over the years. Excavation uncovered pieces of the original structure's foundation and, more importantly, small personal items that were apparently hidden by the people who were held there. A button, a smooth stone, and a piece of carved wood. Williams said that these were tiny assertions of humanity in a place that was meant to take them away. The Alabama Department of Archives and History now has the items that were found. They are simple objects that show how people can keep a sense of self even in the most dehumanizing situations. The Pit and the Pendulum of Justice. Revisiting the Turner Atrocities, written by historian Robert Thompson in 1986, is still the most thorough look at the Turner case. His work benefited from the research of earlier scholars and from newspaper archives that had just been digitized and added more recent accounts. Thompson focused on the unusual legal response to the case. He said that, in a system meant to protect the interests of enslavers, the prosecution of the Turners was a rare instance where the boundaries of acceptable behavior were deemed to have been crossed, even within the morally corrupt framework of slavery. Thompson's analysis showed how important it was that the Turners were ultimately prosecuted not for how they treated enslaved people, but for the murders of white overseers who had found out what they were doing. This legal reality highlights the severe moral failure of the antebellum legal system, which could acknowledge the immorality of murder in certain cases while systematically denying the humanity of enslaved persons. The Turner case exemplifies both a personal atrocity and a glimpse into the broader systemic atrocities of American slavery. Ella Turner's calculated cruelty was an extreme example of a dehumanization that was already built into the legal and social systems of the society in which she lived. The Turner case has slowly come out of the past and into the present, thanks to the work of researchers, archivists, and community historians. The fragments of evidence that survive continue to yield new insights when examined with contemporary analytical tools and perspectives. Digital humanities projects have helped bring together and organize records that were previously scattered, making it possible to see events in a more complete way. In 2012, work began on a memorial park close to where the old Turner plantation used to be. The memorial, which was finished in 2014, doesn't just remember the Turner case. It remembers all the people who were enslaved in Montgomery County. A small plaque remembers the horrible things that happened to people with the Turner name. It says, "On this land, human cruelty reached exceptional depths, but human resilience proved deeper still." The Turner plantation story shows us that real horror isn't in supernatural events, but in how cruel people can be, especially when they have power, intelligence, and the ability to justify bad behavior. It also reminds us that people can be brave, fight back, and survive, even when the odds are against them. The most unsettling aspect of the Turner case may not be its uniqueness, but the systemic framework that facilitated it. Ella Turner did not operate in isolation. She functioned within a societal framework that had already normalized the fundamental dehumanization of enslaved individuals. Her experiments did not signify a deviation from the rationale of slavery. Rather, they represented its escalation to a horrific denouement. As we continue to deal with the effects of slavery and its aftermath in American society, cases like the Turner plantation show us how systems of oppression hurt not only the people who are oppressed, but also the people who benefit from and take part in the oppression. The damage goes in all directions, but not always in the same way. We will never know for sure what really happened at the Turner plantation. There were too many voices that were silenced, too many records that were lost or never made, and too many experiences that were never recorded. What we have left is a partial account, made up of bits and pieces. It's enough to give us an idea of how horrible it was, but not enough to show us everything. Maybe that incompleteness is appropriate. The Turner case, like the larger history it is a part of, is hard to solve or get away from. It keeps bothering me, making me ask questions, and needing to be recognized. The most important lesson from that constant discomfort is that the past is never really over, that understanding requires constant effort, and that remembering is both a witness and a warning. The land where the Turner plantation used to be has changed a lot over time and with development. There is no physical evidence that a casual observer can see. But for those who know the history, the landscape will never be the same because of what happened there. Some shadows stay even when the sun shines on them. Some stories still need to be told, even if the ending doesn't make them feel better. Scholars have studied Ella Turner's last written words, which were found on a single preserved page in the Montgomery County archives, for generations to learn more about her motivations and state of mind. They think the greatest pain lies in physical suffering, but I have found it lives in the mind, in the spaces between what was and what might be. These words have been seen as a confession, a justification, or just an observation. Maybe they are all of these things, or none of them. It is certain that Ella Turner understood a fundamental truth about human psychology, that mental suffering can be as bad or worse than physical pain. She used that knowledge on purpose. In doing so, she set the stage for methods that would later be improved and used in different situations throughout history. Her private experimentation presaged more systematic implementations of psychological manipulation. The Turner case serves as a reminder that scientific inquiry devoid of ethical constraints can transform into a rationale for significant human harm rather than a means of human progress. It reminds us that calling any group less than fully human makes it easier for people to commit terrible acts and say they are doing something else. The landscape in Montgomery today looks very different from what it did in 1851. The cotton fields are gone, the plantation houses are gone or changed, and the legal system has changed a lot. But even with these changes, some things stay the same. How people remember and forget, who counts and who doesn't, and the ongoing fight to fully recognize the humanity of all people. The story of the Turner plantation lives on, not because it is unique, but because it is a good example. In its particulars, we discern specificity. However, in its overarching contours, we identify patterns that transcend a singular time and location. It is both a history lesson and a warning, reminding us of what can happen when we don't see ourselves in others. So, the record is still not complete, but it is not silent. The voices are partially recovered, but not completely restored, and the truth is seen, but never fully captured. The events that took place at the Turner plantation in the spring of 1851 still have an effect on people today. They show how low people can go and how high they can rise, even when faced with planned cruelty. Once some doors are opened, they can never really be closed again. Some stories don't end in a way that makes sense. Some wounds, even after they heal, still change the body that has them. Our best chance of making sure that these terrible things don't happen again is to face the uncomfortable truth